Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to keep letting people into the session, but I do just want to get started to be respectful of everyone's time. So this morning, Dr. Castro will introduce herself, but I just wanted to let everyone know, if you have any questions during the session, you can drop them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand button in Zoom, and then we can just answer as we go along. You don't have to wait till the end to answer your questions. And with that, I will also be monitoring the chat, obviously. So Dr. Castro, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nichol Castro, and I'll be giving a little preview of things that I've experienced recruiting older adults for research. So some of the things I'm going to talk about are just who are older adults. It's good to know who we're talking about, and then some of the facilitators and barriers to recruitment that I've experienced or have had colleagues experience, and then some considerations for a successful session before recruitment even begins. I'll leave time at the end also for questions, problem solving, any scenarios or other tips or suggestions people might have themselves experience with older adults. But first, I'm going to do a little introduction of myself. This will help you not just know the type of research I do, but also show kind of the variety of experiences I've had in research with older adults. So my work with older adults has started all the way from the very beginning when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. I worked in a psychology lab focused on word finding problems. So when people are trying to get out a word but can't get it in the moment, or they make speech errors when they're trying to produce language. And really one of the things we know about aging, normal, typical aging, is that these word finding problems tend to increase a little bit as we get older. So in that lab, there's a big interest in younger and older adults' experiences with word finding. And some of the work I was involved in was looking at situational factors like stress and social anxiety and how that might impact word finding abilities. From there, I went to the University of Kansas and did my PhD in psychology and gerontology. And this was a very computational linguistic heavy psychology focused research, still looking at word retrieval, but thinking about how these words are represented in memory. So what is our mental dictionary, if you will? Each person's mental dictionary is a little bit different. And so we were using different computational methods to try and map out people's dictionaries. Still very much interested in younger and older adults and how their life experiences might shape their dictionaries differently. But again, very computational approach. So kind of combining modeling approaches with behavioral data. From there, I was still very much interested in this effect of aging, and we know a lot about cognitive aging. So I did my first postdoc at Georgia Tech, looking at cognitive aging specifically. And one thing that's interesting that we know about cognitive aging is that some things get better with age and some things start to decline with age. Again, typical aging in the absence of any disease or disorder. So things like processing speed and working memory tend to decline as we get older, but other aspects like world knowledge, which includes the words we know, actually increase. So our vocabulary expands as we have new experiences, we have new language to go along with that. So at Georgia Tech, we're really interested in looking at kind of this difference between things that increase and things that decline, and maybe early markers of word retrieval for cognitive aging. Very much still interested in this clinical aspect now of word finding and cognition, and started to look very closely at a population where word finding problems are quite prevalent. So I went to the University of Washington and did a second postdoc in clinical aphasiology. So for those who don't know, aphasia is a language disorder that often occurs after a stroke, traumatic brain injury, or even neurodegeneration to language centers of the brain. When that happens, these individuals can experience word finding problems. Given the etiologies, stroke especially as our primary etiology of aphasia, older adults make up a large proportion of individuals living with aphasia. So there's kind of this nice connection between typical aging as well as a clinical disorder that manifests more often in older adults, and still looking at word finding and how do we rehabilitate that? How do we improve word finding abilities for these individuals? I'm here now. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communicative Disorders and Sciences. Still looking again at word retrieval and how this is impacted by a whole variety of factors. My work has really taken a very holistic biopsychosocial perspective on word finding in people with aphasia. So we need to know what their mental dictionary is. We need to know what their cognitive processes are, but we also need to know how they're doing these word finding tasks in everyday situations with or without social support, how their mental states impact their word finding abilities, and even going to more biological like genetic and brain factors that might impact word finding. All of this with an eye towards more precision medicine or precision rehabilitation approaches to treating individuals with aphasia from this perspective. So hopefully what you can see kind of across this line of research is I have a lot of experience working with younger and older adults. Our oldest participant that I've directly interacted with was 99 years young, but there's lots of research out there on individuals who are 100 years older. So there's a whole variety of research being done across the lifespan. My work has looked at both cognitively, what we call normal adults, as well as adults with cognitive impairments or aphasia, anyone 18 years and older. And we've used a variety of different recruitment resources. So everything from online, like Amazon MTurk, Prolific, Gorilla, those types of services, as well as through kind of the more traditional community and university resources like registries, clinical providers, and just word of mouth. I've also collaborated and worked with data from colleagues who are recruiting directly in community placements. So maybe going to a retirement community or an assisted living facility, giving a presentation or leading some kind of activity, and then also collecting data while they're there. So that'll just give you a sense of some of those broad interactions I've had in my research. So that gets us to the topics for today. Who are older adults? Facilitators and barriers and considerations for a successful session. So we'll start with who are older adults. All the demographics I'm going to share in this little section largely come from the Older Population 2020 report from the U.S. Census Bureau or just from data charts in the U.S. Census Bureau. If you're working with older adults or you have students who are, maybe this is their first experience working with older adults, it's a nice, easy report to kind of peruse through and see all the different demographics and figures that go along with it. So nationally, when we typically talk about older adults, we have typically looked at 65 years and older. That's historically been linked to retirement age of being 65. So demographic statistics typically look at 65 and older. We also have demographics focused on 85 and older, and then 100 years and older. So there's different points at which we can talk about older adults. Depends on the research. You might even go as young as 50 to kind of capture the early midlife aging that's happening before we get to 65, 85, 100 years old. So just demographically speaking, in the United States, 1 in 6 people in 2020 were 65 years of age or older. So that's 16.8% of the population. And you can see over the last 100 years from 1920 to 2020 that this proportion of the population is continuing to increase. And I always find the centenarians, those 100 years and older, fascinating. We have quite a large number of centenarians. In 2020, it was about 80,000 individuals who are 100 years and older, and that was a 50% increase from 2010. So just over a decade, we had a large increase. And this is these increases are largely driven by the baby boomer generation aging into these older adult ranges. Here are just some demographics about race and Hispanic origin. We have it for individuals 65 years or under 65 years on the left and individuals 65 and over on the right. And you can see the comparisons from 2010 census to 2020 census. And I'm just going to point out one point here, looking at the diversity of our population throughout the entire nation. You can see from 2010 to 2020, the percentage of the population reporting white alone is decreasing. But this is not just among our younger adults or individuals under 65, but also among our older adult population. So it's important to always keep in mind that diversity is going to continue increasing in this country, and we need to think about who our participants are today are probably going to be a little bit different than who they were even 10 or 15 years ago. A little bit about where older adults are at in the United States living. So on the left are 65 years and over, the proportion of that state, 65 years and over. And then on the right is 85 years and over. And if you just want to look at New York here, we're pretty much right on par with the national average. So again, the national number is 16.8% of the population, 65 and over, and New York is falling in that medium green 17 or 16 to 16.9%. We do have slightly more individuals 85 years and over compared to the national figure. We're at about 2 to 2.2% of the New York population 85 years and over. And then last one for national demographics is rural versus urban settings in which these individuals are living. You can see that most older adults are living in urban settings, but there's still a large number that are living in rural settings. And if you go to the report, there's some really interesting data about rural counties where there's a much larger proportion of their county being 65 years and older compared to the national average. So again, greater than 16%, maybe 20 or 25% of that rural county is an older adult. So there are implications there for services and for research, thinking about rural versus urban living adults. And then lastly, just a few points for local demographics. In Erie County, about 20% of the population is 65 years and older. And of those individuals, about 30% are living with a disability. And then here is race and Hispanic origin for Erie County individuals aged 65 to 84 years. So we have about 85% reporting white alone as their race in Erie County in this older adult range. And our diversity index is 27%. So that means there's a 27% chance that two people chosen at random are from different racial and ethnic groups. This is higher compared to our surrounding counties, but definitely not the highest in New York State. You can imagine downstate by the city, those counties have much higher diversity indexes. And so I kind of alluded to this, but I just want to end this little section by reminding all of us that as we age, our participants are also aging and changing. And so who was a 65-year-old in 2010 when I did my very first research studies to who a 65-year-old is today in 2025 is very different, even if we just look at the generation in which they belong to. So you can see here, if I were to test a 50 to 64-year-old in 2010, they were part of the baby boomer generation. A 65 to 80-year-old, they were part of the silent generation, and an 81 to 95-year-old was largely part of the greatest generation and a little bit there also with the silent generation. Now in 2025, they also are aging, so they shift. The 50 to 64-year-olds I saw in 2010 are now the 65 to 80-year-olds that I'm seeing. And the same for 65 to 80, now being the 81 to 95-year-olds. And so this has implications for the research we're doing. If we're comparing to research from, a decade or more ago, those participants might be very different. And that might impact not just our research outcomes, but how we do research with these individuals. And just to point out, we're starting to see Gen X kind of merging into this midlife and will eventually become the older adults that we see in our research studies as well. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for just a second. That was our section on who are older adults. And we're going to now move into facilitators and barriers to recruitment. So here I'm going to share tips, suggestions, things that I've experienced working with older adults and share some stories along the way about these experiences. So I'm going to talk a lot about age-friendly language and why that's important and how to do it. Talk about snowbirding and then research biases that impact recruitment as well as the data that we might obtain from older adults. So to talk about age-friendly language, we have to address the stereotypes that exist in society about older adults, particularly in the United States, but many other cultures as well have these negative stereotypes of aging. There are positive stereotypes, but predominantly, at least in our society, we still continue to see a lot more of the negative stereotypes in media, for example. So some of these stereotypes include older adults being cognitively impaired, physically dependent, ill-tempered, technology avoidant, And these stereotypes are perpetuated in part by the language we use in talking about older adults. I'm a language person, and so this is really important to think about the types of words, the adjectives, the descriptions we give when talking about older adults. And you can see some of those here, whether they're bitter or slow thinking, forgetful, rambling. When we describe older adults in those ways, we continue these stereotypes. Now, I'm going to talk about how to be more age-friendly in our language for recruitment materials and for research, but I just wanted to take a moment to point out why this is important and particularly how this impacts research with a very clear example that I think will be something that you'll all be able to relate to. So funding is really important for research. Unfortunately, there's underrepresentation in our predominant funding schemes for clinical trials and clinical research. We see underrepresentation across a variety of historically marginalized backgrounds, but this includes older adults. So even in a recent study in 2022, there's still evidence of underrepresentation of older adults. This typically happens when studies put a cap on their research participants for age. So they say as an exclusion criteria that participants cannot be 65 years and older. And what often comes out, sometimes very explicitly and sometimes implicitly in their rationale, is that they're concerned about some of these negative stereotypes. They're concerned about them being fatigued too easily to participate in the study. They're concerned about cognitive impairment that has not yet been diagnosed. And so they exclude these older adults because they're concerned about these stereotypes that may or may not exist about their participants. Now, in 2017, the 21st Century Cures Act made a lot of movement to address some of these underrepresentation problems. And one was NIH starting to expand one of their grant documents to now be the inclusion across the lifespan document. It used to focus predominantly on children, but now includes older adults. So researchers have to state in this grant document why they have age caps if they do, and why it's scientifically justified if they do have those age caps. So it's not just because they're concerned or fearful that these individuals might have cognitive impairment, but they actually have to justify it scientifically. We have ways of measuring if people have cognitive impairment, and the cognitive impairment test can be the exclusion criteria, but just having a broad age cap is often not acceptable anymore. And this grant document only really began in 2019. It's not that long ago where this was a requirement of NIH grants. So just a very clear example here. Okay, so how do we kind of move away from these negative stereotypes and use more age-friendly language? So I'm going to reference here the APA Inclusive Language Guide. This is a table directly from it. It's an excellent resource. I encourage everyone to check it out. Here are terms to avoid that the APA suggests, so we don't talk about older adults as being elderly or aged or even seniors. It's more appropriate or suggested that we talk about them as older adults, or even be very explicit, persons 60 years and older, or persons 80 years and older. That gets away from those negative connotations of terms like elderly and aged, and just is more inclusive and explicit in what we're talking about. Some other examples is geriatric pregnancy for individuals who are pregnant at 35 or older, and the silver tsunami. I cannot tell you how many gerontology papers I read in my early studies where the first line of the introduction was the silver tsunami is coming, or the silver tsunami is here. It's a very negative weather event. It's a very destructive weather event. Why are we describing a population of people in that kind of terminology? So again, being more clear and precise with our language, talking about population changes and demographic changes is a better way of describing that change rather than using a term like silver tsunami. So these types of language, these types of words can be used in our recruitment materials, our study materials, in any kind of publications or press reports. And I will just plug the CTSI here. The Recruitment and Special Populations Core is really helpful with recruitment materials. They still look at my materials and provide feedback, and I love it. A second set of eyes is always helpful to make sure that we're avoiding biases and we have more inclusive materials. And again, just one more plug for APA Inclusive Language Guide. If you're working on any of these identity-related terms, the APA has charts like I just showed you. So things for disability, neurodiversity, race, ethnicity, and so on. You can see what are the appropriate terms to use. There's also a section on avoiding microaggressions in conversation, which I actually have students read as a part of a different type of activity. But again, very nice guidelines that you can look at or have students look at for inclusive language. And then the last bit here about age-friendly language is what to avoid. So there's a common communication style that happens. It's been looked at largely in medical settings, but it happens with any older adult in society, where there's this form of communication called elder speak. Where an individual is talking in a way to an older adult that is actually quite demeaning and sometimes patronizing in its delivery. Elder speak is very much like baby talk. So the way a parent might talk to a toddler is how an adult talks to another adult who just happens to be older adult. This elder speak tends to feature slow rate of speech, exaggerated intonation, elevated pitch and volume, more repetition, simpler vocabulary and grammar. And the intent with using this type of speech style, sometimes implicitly or explicitly, is to promote clear and effective communication, but it actually doesn't do that. The way that this communication style is delivered actually has more harm than benefit to older adults and their comprehension of the language that they're trying to understand, as well as just their psychological state. They kind of embody and take in this kind of patronizing, demeaning aspect of being talked down to, if you will, and that makes them feel incompetent, maybe makes them feel a little unsure of themselves. And so we want to avoid this kind of elder speak. So there's some examples here in the table, and I'll just talk out loud about the first two because these are quite common that we see. The first one is using diminutives in a way in which it's not appropriate for the relationship that you have with the older adult. So this often comes out in terms of endearment. So calling someone honey or sweetie. And I always get someone immediately raises their hands up, but I've always called my grandma honey. That's like just how we talk. And that's fine because that's a familial relationship that you have. And it's an established way in which you've communicated with that person. But as a researcher in a position of power with my research participant, who's an older adult, calling them honey is completely inappropriate. I don't have that personal familial affiliation with them. And it's just better to call them by their name. So Mrs. Robinson or Mr. Smith, instead of using these kinds of terms of endearment in an inappropriate setting. The other one, the second one here, is inappropriate use of plural pronouns, particularly collective we pronoun. So here the example is quite clear. Are we ready for our medicine? I'm not taking the medicine. They're taking the medicine. We are not doing this. They are doing this. And so we want to make sure we're using appropriate pronoun in this case to put the agency on the individual who you're asking the question about. So are they ready to take their medicine instead of are we ready to take our medicine? So those are just some examples there. I see chat popped up. Oh, yes. Great comment, Francesca. Yes. Okay. So those are some examples of just ways in which we can communicate through writing and through verbal communication with older adults. So the next topic here I'll talk about is snowbirding. So moving from colder climates to warmer climates during the winter. This happens a lot for many people, not just older adults, but we do see this a lot with older adults, especially those who are retired and maybe are able to do more of that traveling back and forth based on the season. So do keep this in mind for recruitment and scheduling. This can be a barrier to recruitment and scheduling, especially if you're on a timeline that you need to hit for recruitment targets. I like this little graphic because it actually includes Buffalo and where Buffalonians go. And apparently it's Orlando, Florida, where most of our older adult Buffalonians are going. In addition to snowbirding, just other types of aspects, seasonal aspects that you might think about in recruitment. Summer vacation can be very difficult. We have many participants that come through our lab who go on cruises or other summer vacations with their grandchildren. And so summer and winter is very hard. Spring and fall is the best time to recruit. Daily weather and road conditions. So even if individuals are here in Buffalo, they may not feel comfortable leaving their home to come to a research session. And same if there's any kind of flu or cold season. Even a couple years after COVID started to die down and people were getting out more, we still saw that older adults were more reluctant to come out for a research session, especially if they knew there was kind of another uptick in COVID cases. So just keep that in mind, that there are these different aspects that might impact older adults particularly or differently than other populations in recruitment and scheduling. And then last one is research biases, or who participates in research and the data that we end up with at the end of the day. These research biases impact many studies, not just studies with older adults. And so keep that in mind, but I'm going to talk about why this is impactful specifically for older adults. So the first bias to know is self-selection bias. This is when participants choose to participate in a study. That motivation factor is always something we have to consider, whether it's compensation, curiosity, whatever that might be. Individuals are motivated to participate in this study. Now, especially for the work I do on cognition and language, many older adults will come to my study and say very explicitly, I want to know if I'm okay. I want to know if I have any cognitive problems. Do I need to see a doctor? Those are real concerns that they have, and sometimes they bring that with them to the study as why they want to participate. So having a plan in place about how you respond to those questions might be really important, especially if you're working on anything that might be health or medical related. Sometimes our study is just that. We are tracking people's cognition over time. And so we can have that conversation about their performance, and we write that into our IRB on sharing clinical results. So again, you just have a plan in place, but that might be a bias that you want to consider for older adult participants. Survivor bias. So this is that older adults have made it to older adulthood. And so there might be biases in them reaching this age in which they're now participating in the study. Maybe they're healthier, and that's an important factor that you need to think about for some research studies or topic areas. This comes up a lot, for example, in research on centenarians, individuals who are 100 years and older. They clearly have made it to a very high mark in age that is not experienced by many people. So that might bias the types of outcomes that we have. And that's a big part of who are centenarians. How have they survived this long, right? But that is a bias that we have to account for in our research and our recruitment. And then the last one, selective attrition. So participants will drop out of studies, especially longitudinal or multi-session studies. For older adults, there's additional concerns with attrition like illness, death, not just this lack of interest or not wanting to participate anymore. So if you're doing longitudinal studies, you're going to have to think about recruitment efforts to capture more people at the outset than you might anticipate needing, knowing that attrition is probably going to happen. And then also making sure that you're designing your study to capture attrition. Why are people leaving? So that way you can capture that appropriately in your outcomes. So all of these biases, again, they're going to happen in research, but making sure that you're proactive in thinking about it. What is the impact that these biases are going to have on generalizability of research? And then if you can think about ways to promote more inclusive recruitment, that can help address some of these biases as well. Okay, so that brings us to the end of that second section. And then the last bit here is just some considerations for a successful session before you even start recruiting. So thinking about study design, recruitment, issues that might come up before you even get to recruiting people. Okay, so I have 3 points here. The first one I'm going to talk about is thinking about wayfinding and accessibility of your research space. Universities, institutions, medical centers are notorious for having poor wayfinding. They can be really difficult to navigate. Even if there are signs in place, sometimes those signs aren't easily readable or distinguishable. Maybe there's a whole slew of signs and it's hard to figure out what's the one sign that you need to look for. And accessibility. So while our campus and medical facilities are ADA compliant, the most accessible route may not be the fastest, quickest, most direct route. And so that can still have implications for fatigue, physical fatigue, and wayfinding problems that might emerge. So if you're thinking about recruiting older adults, it's really important to carefully analyze what your situation is, what your location is for your research space, and how these older adults are going to get there. How are they going to navigate to your research space? So some suggestions here: make sure to provide parking maps. Parking is notoriously hard to navigate. Maybe providing explicit step-by-step instructions on you're going to do this thing and then this thing and then this thing to get to the research lab. You might even include pictures of landmarks to go along with any text directions that you provide. Or you might even consider just meeting them at an easy access point and walking with them. Not only does that give you time to build more rapport with your research participant, but it also just helps make sure that they will get to your research lab and not get lost in a hallway somewhere. And then in terms of accessibility, I also want to emphasize not to assume that someone is able to walk upstairs or able to take long paths. We want to make sure that we have accessible spaces. And so it's always good to check in with your research participant when you're scheduling them to confirm, especially if you do have stairs or a long route that has to be taken, confirm with them that that's going to be okay. So, when you're scheduling someone, you might mention that there's 3 or 4 steps they're going to have to climb to get to the lab space. Is that okay? Or should I provide you a different route? And so that might be a question you can add to kind of your recruitment script for scheduling. If that's a difficult issue, location space is always hard to negotiate with administrators or supervisors. But if you're going to be doing this work with older adults, you can pitch and ask for space that is going to be accessible and ADA compliant. So that's a good argument to make always for your research participants to make sure that they're able to engage in the study. Here's just an example of what we do. I'm on South Campus in Cary Hall, and so we have a kind of more simplified Google map that people can look at that has some landmarks, like the Buffalo VA is a big landmark for local residents, and we kind of have text directions that go along with that picture. And then we also include a real picture, so that's also from Google Maps, of the parking lot where they're going to park and where we will meet them at under that point of the building. So that way there's some visuals to go along with any text directions that we provide. Now, I'll just say that this comes largely from personal experience. So I was born with congenital cataracts, which is an eye condition where it's really difficult to see with certain lighting conditions. So if the sun is behind a sign, for example, I can tell you the shape of the sign, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what was written on the sign. And so I always navigated by landmarks. I would turn on the 3rd Street on the right, or I would turn left at the Jiffy Lube, or at the statue. So having landmarks can be really helpful. Cataracts are common among older adults. So again, kind of thinking about your parking maps, your directions, your physical spaces, accessibility can be really helpful in providing those instructions to your participants. Okay, the second point here about things to consider before starting recruitment is how you're going to provide breaks or refreshments during the research session. There's many reasons why we should provide breaks and refreshments, and I hope that's obvious to people, but I just want to emphasize for older adults in particular, there are many reasons why talking can be really difficult, especially for long periods of time. And at least in my research sessions, sometimes there's a lot of talking involved. So older adults may have side effects of medications that they're taking that reduce saliva and can make the mouth dry out faster. So that can impact talking for long periods of time. There are also physiological and biological changes happening to swallowing mechanisms that can make talking for long periods of time difficult. So having water available at a minimum is something that I would highly suggest. And of course, providing breaks during the session, especially if it's a long session or anything cognitively demanding. We want these people to enjoy the experience, to be able to engage and do their best performance. So these are simple ways in which we can help. If you have If you don't have like access to a water fountain, maybe even consider just buying a Brita picture and having that in the lab or the space where you're testing. The very simple ways, or having water bottles accessible, are simple ways to provide a refreshment for them. And then the last point here is to build rapport. So I've kind of touched on this, but it's really important that older adults or any research participant has a positive experience. This is going to increase their likelihood to continue participating. We're currently using the Buffalo Research Registry for a study with older adults, and I cannot tell you how many of them have come in and said, I really enjoyed my last study, and that's why I wanted to sign up for this one as well. And we want to continue paying that forward to ourselves as we continue to recruit from that registry, but also to other researchers who are using that registry. So again, build rapport, make it so that way they're going to have a positive experience. Think about how you're going to do that. Nowadays, much of my research is actually done by student research assistants. So they're the ones interacting with older adults in most cases. And we have long conversations about how to do that, especially because the students are much younger in age compared to the older adult research participants. There's some intergenerational communication style differences there that we talk about. How do you have a conversation with this older adult in a professional manner that doesn't use elder speak, that you're not treating them like they're your grandma, that they're an adult with agency, they just happen to be older than you. So we have those conversations, and that really helps build that rapport and that positive research experience. Okay. So that's what I have to share for today. I have my email here. If anyone would like to reach out, I'm happy to chat at any time, but we can also open it up for questions. I can stop sharing and make this more conversational.
I think it was an excellent presentation that you gave, because it really covers, for me as a Black person, you're talking to me. People always want to talk. Sometimes people want to talk slang and stuff to Black. Hey, just talk to me regular. I can hear. So a lot of what you're saying goes for any group of any diversity. The only thing you didn't say is, you speak English, right? But I'm just saying, this is very common sense, straightforward. This can be used for anything. I almost forgot what was the purpose, because the purpose of your information was just very informative. It wasn't necessarily it was common courtesy. If you invite a friend over to a house, many times you ask them, can I get you something to drink? These are people you're inviting into your house. Look at them as you would your friends. And if you treat your friends real shabbily, well, you know what, then this won't mean a thing to people. But just think of treating this, the survey, the old, speaking with older people, honey. And someone got into a fight once over that. I remember, I'm not going to say where, but someone got into a fight over that by someone calling them sweet. Just say hello. You don't have to say honey or sweetie. You don't even have to say their name. Acknowledge them. May I help you? Because we know sir and ma'am, they we don't know. We have a crazy administration that's banning all that, but we're not them. So I think what you said was excellent. It was right on time. If you at some point want to share those slides, I think you just gave I thought your presentation was 2 thumbs up.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's all about just being a good human, right? A good person and interacting with these individuals. Yeah.
Hi, this is Mary. I work in the Department of Orthopedics, and I deal with joint replacement patients. So all my studies I very rarely have somebody below 50. And I do have to say, even with my long experience with this, the studies I deal with do not exhibit these kind of shortcomings. So maybe this is a good place to look for examples, because the studies are not written or performed with any of these things you pointed out. I have never honestly experienced most of them, which is probably a good thing. But the other thing too is the patients that are getting up in ages is a lot different than the patients who were in the same age group even 10 or 15 years ago. They're very active. They're very healthy. Um, I don't personally see changes with patients unless they're late 70s, early 80s. I mean, we follow patients into their 90 plus years because our studies go out 10 years. So I honestly can say I haven't seen these things. I agree with all your comments, but again, maybe the joint replacement literature is a place to look for to how things have been set up actually for years.
Thank you.
Hi, name is Mo Yanim again. I'm the quality assurance specialist for the CTSI. But in my past lives, I've been a research assistant, worked with different populations, different studies. One of the things you mentioned, obviously, and it's very relevant to this population, is those intergenerational differences and how you have research assistants who are, could be grandchildren of a lot of the participants. What about the other side? In my experience, I mean, it's not uncommon that the population you're working with, I don't want to say they're inappropriate, but they're using the language that you're trying to stay away from. On you, they're calling you honey. It happens all the time. So how do you? And I don't know, maybe you mentioned this, but how do you deal with those kinds of potential challenges? And how do you train your staff? And so that side of things.
Yeah, that's a great question. Really important question. That goes into some of our conversations about intergenerational communication, where we talk about one of the activities we do is like, how would you relay this information? And then I give them an example of how an older adult might relay that information. And we talk about how that looks very different. And sometimes it conflicts and it's not appropriate behavior. And we talk about how to manage that. Depending on the severity of that inappropriateness, we may kind of acknowledge it and move past it. We may sit down and have a really deep conversation if it's racist or something like that, right? That's very traumatizing, right? We don't want those kinds of interactions, and we will have very long conversations about that. And maybe that's not a research participant we want to see. So we can make those kinds of decisions. But sometimes if it's kind of these inappropriate things that are more mild, like being called honey, we might say, oh, my name is Sophia, or my name is Nicole. Like, you can call me that. You don't need to call me Mrs. Smith, but you can call me Nicole. That works just fine, right? And so we can continue to correct them and help them understand and kind of shift their language. But that can be challenging. And so we do have those conversations. And if students experience things, they immediately come to me and we have a debrief about that and discuss whether or not that participant comes back if it's a longitudinal study, or how we're going to address if those kinds of problem behaviors continue. I will say they're very rare. They don't happen often, which we're fortunate about. But it is good to be thinking about that and knowing how you're going to respond. Practice how you're going to respond before it happens is much better than being bombarded with something and not knowing how to respond in the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat that just came up. It says, do you have suggestions on how to address digital health equity among older people, especially for individuals not familiar with digital health?
That's a great question. So one of the stereotypes, and I think someone was alluding to this in a previous comment, was that technology is not really a barrier as much for the current 65-year-olds, for example, that we're seeing now. 10, 15 years ago, maybe that was more of a barrier than it is now. I will say there's still problems, especially when we're thinking about rural versus urban living, low versus high SES participants. Those factors probably play more of an impact on access to digital health and digital research or virtual research than age. So I would say don't assume your older adults can't use technology or don't want to use technology. Sometimes they might need some training. There are ways in which we can make technology more accessible for everyone, including for older adults. Maybe thinking about dexterity and how many buttons they might have to push on a screen, or the amount of information you're providing on the screen at a time. But there's ways we can accommodate and make that accessible for anyone, including older adults, with any kind of digital technology or digital types of research that are being done. But I will say they are willing and able to participate. Many of our participants would actually rather do online studies or studies at home, and would be very interested in digital health studies. So reach out to them. They're there. They want to do it.
This is Mary again. I have a comment because I deal with this every day. One thing we find useful is get somebody, if they're in the office with their daughter or somebody, get the sibling, their child involved, because they'll be like, Mom, this is really easy. And then they show them, we show them. So there's really a lot of ways you can get around this. I do know that patients are not crazy about going online to websites, but they like their tablets and they like doing things on the cell phone.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think the websites is challenging because a lot of websites are not accessible. We have a lot of problems still today about websites that are not accessible. Yeah, so apps and tablets are much easier to navigate.
Does anyone else have any questions? Going once.
Sorry, I was just thinking along the accessibility of the tablets or the even using their phones. I mean, especially as you mentioned, vision issues, like they can, if they're having trouble reading a questionnaire on a form, like they can make the text bigger if that's a capability in your surveys and if you have them online. So
willing to be adapted for anything.
That's a great point. Thank you, Alexis.
If there are no more questions, I just want to thank you all for participating, coming today, and for Dr. Castro for giving a wonderful presentation. Dr. Castro, if you want to send me the slides, I can turn them into a PDF and I can send them to all of you who attended today. And thank you all for coming. Have a great day.
Absolutely. I'll send you the slides. Thank you.
Thank you.